thank you for staying until this late. So this is our conclusion of the two-day symposium, and I'm very happy to introduce Professor Randy LaPolla. Um, Let me just do very briefly summarize his accomplishment, academic life. He just retired, but he was a professor in the Center for Language Sciences Institute for Advanced Studies in Humanities and Social Sciences, based in Normal University. And before that, he was a professor of linguistics at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, at La Trobe University, Melbourne. He was also a member of Academic Sinica, and he had many appointments. He worked at City University of Hong Kong, and also he was elected fellow of the Australian Academy for the Humanities and president of the Australian Linguistic Society, honorary member of the Philippine Linguistic Society, Singapore Association for Applied Linguistics, Sino-Tibetan, and Austronesian languages, his field. So he is everywhere in Asia, and he has a very deep knowledge of many languages. And so he's the most discussant, and he wanted to come to join us to this meeting physically, but several things prevented him from coming. But I'm so glad that you so willing to participate this online. I don't know what time it is in the Philippines, but very early. And I know that you stayed up all morning or all night just to listen to all the presentations. And so we really appreciate your contribution to our symposium and our whole discipline of Asian linguistics. So without further delay, please join me welcoming in Randy LaPolla.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Yeah, I've been kind of all over the place. Every time I move, it's looking for a more interactive environment. You know, sometimes the climate in different universities changes, and then there's nobody to talk to, and so you move to a place where you have people you can talk to. So that's kind of been my motivation moving around. I just want to start with initial historical comment for the young people there. We've mentioned a couple of times Michael Krause's 1992 paper, and I'd just like to mention how important that was and how that caused the sea change in linguistics. Before that kind of awakening, the Chomsky's way of seeing things was pretty dominant, at least in the US. And so that meant nobody did field work, or very few people did field work. And the thing is, if you did field work and you wrote a grammar for your PhD, it meant you didn't get a job. You would not get a job at all because it was seen as descriptive linguistics rather than theoretical linguistics. And so you would never get a job. Luckily, after Krause's article, the Linguistic Society of America started to allow, and really that's the word to use, it started to allow people to write articles about their field work and things they discovered while doing field work, but they had to do it in a kind of backdoor way. They opened a special session at the LSA conferences for such fieldwork reports of endangered languages. They had to be endangered because the excuse was that we had to do something about endangered languages. But this at least opened the door to people starting to do fieldwork again and being recognized for it, because it's kind of rehabilitated the whole idea of doing field work. And so that has now snowballed so that we have no problem now with students writing grammars for the PhDs, and most of my students have done that. There's also been, of course, a major change from late 20th century structuralism, the Bloomfield, Chomsky structuralism that dominated the 20th century generally. Into the 21st century, we've had this cognitive turn, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, which is really a return to more anthropological linguistics. So I'll just mention that briefly in a minute. So I wanted to bring up a couple of aspects that I've seen talked about in some of the papers. I'm not going to talk about each paper individually, but just some of the general issues that have come up. So one of them in the paper about Indonesian was this question of exclusive unity or diversity in unity. So this is something that many different countries have had to decide on. So the question that was put in the paper by Ravindranath and Kohn, should Indonesian be a force for unity at the expense of the diversity of existing languages and cultures, or should national unity be built on a foundation that accommodates and appreciates ethno-linguistic diversity? There's two aspects to this that I want to mention. One is this is a social and political question, often determined by economic considerations. The other one is that once you select a single variety for special treatment, it kind of erases or at least subjugates the other varieties, so they become marginalized, which is what we've been talking about here. So it's problematic in that sense. As they talk about in that paper, even a language with a large speaker base can be endangered, particularly when a new nation state determines that a national language, often engineered as Indonesian was, is necessary for unifying the new country. Jeffrey Benjamin, who works in Singapore and is a really fantastic linguist, has written a very good paper, republished, actually. It was a 1985 paper, but republished in 2015 because it's so seminal, on the nature of the new nation states and the need of nation states to cut people off from their roots in order to create and unify the new nation. So a lot of these language policies are actually meant to cut people off from their roots. So trying to maintain your heritage is actually going against the grain of a new nation state. Within Asia, we've seen this occur in Indonesia, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, Philippines, Korea. I'll mention a few examples that I'm very familiar with and the choices that were made in those countries. As I mentioned, once a single variety is chosen as the standard, the other equally valid varieties are erased or downgraded to lesser status. The linguist or other power that determines which variety to give status to changes the situation on the ground. And it's another good article is this Easton and Stebbins, which talks about how even a linguist going into an area, or in the past, missionaries going into an area and picking a particular variety for development as a sort of standard or for writing the Bible or whatever, actually changes the situation on the ground. In other words, the balance between the languages. And this has happened over and over again. So in China, I'll start with China, the biggest one. After the defeat of China by Japan in the War of 1895, China looked to Japan for the secret of its strength. Like, how could this little country, beat China? One aspect they noticed was that Japan had a single language that was seen to unify the country, Kokugo, national language. And so Chinese linguists such as Y.R. Zhao Youren, and then borrowed the concept and even the name, pronounced Guoyu in Mandarin, for the engineered language they created in 1920. So Mandarin was the Guoyu, I should say, was created by a committee in 1920. and then promulgated at the expense of other possible things. There was a long discussion of which variety of Chinese or possibly English to choose as the national language of China. And they chose to engineer a variety of Mandarin. The Mandarin is a wide swath of languages, and so they kind of created a variety that they thought would be easy to learn by a lot of people. They also borrowed the concept and the word minzoku from Japanese, the ethnic group, but pronounced it as minzu. And this has had a big effect, which I'll mention in a little while also, on the maintenance of languages. The spread of this language, now called Putonghua, common speech, has been a major concern of the PRC government in its efforts to unify the country. So other phonetic varieties were suppressed, slightly less so now in some places, at least Fujian. And there has been a big push to get the minority peoples to learn Mandarin. There is an ideology of Mandarin as well as of being Han, the major ethnic group, that they equate to and are required for modernization. So minority peoples are strongly encouraged, to put it politely, to learn Mandarin because that's the only way to become modern in China, as the ideology goes. There's now an attempt to downpedal ethnic differences in China to the extent that some minority scholars I know no longer designate themselves as their traditional ethnic group, like Qiang or Tibetan or whatever, but use Zhonghua Minzu or Chinese ethnic group as their designation. In other words, it's kind of erasing the concept of ethnicity. For example, what used to be individual minority language schools at the Central University for Nationalities, which was set up to train minority speakers to be able to go back and be officials in their own areas. These different departments have been merged into a college called the College of the Common Body of the Chinese Ethnic Group. So kind of erasing again the differences between the ethnic groups and their languages. Turning to Singapore, Li Kuan Yew, we heard from Nala about Singapore a bit. Li Kuan Yew decided that Hokkien, which was the major lingua franca of the 1970s, was not a useful language, and so forced everyone to switch to it, just at the drop of a hat, switch to speaking English and or Mandarin to foreign languages, because there were very few native speakers of either one. As he said, people only have 2 gigabytes of brain power, and so he felt he needed to suppress all other Sinitic varieties, though also granted official status to Malay and Tamil, but not to other Indic varieties. This policy backfired in a way, as it led to the development of Singlish and a local variety of Mandarin in a very short time, as the speakers of Hokkien maintained their original cognitive categories and habits and simply relexicalized or relexified their Hokkien with English or Mandarin words, creating new language varieties. But the government is no slouch. They have since co-opted Singlish in its National Day rallies as a marker of unique Singaporean identity. And there, just to give you an example of Singlish, in the yellow marked things, you can see where this Joanna says, I got say me, which is word for word Hokkien, wow, gong me. But the me actually is Cantonese, because the Hokkien spoken in Singapore is a mixture of not only several different varieties of Southern Min, but also Cantonese and possibly some other influences, of course Malay as well. And then later she says, they sell what one? Where here the one, this looks something like an English word, a normal English sentence, but the one here is a nominalizer in the sense of Ivoy Simie. So what do they sell is what it means. You know, what is it that they sell? And a lot of times when, even if it seems like an English sentence, the cognition behind it is Hokkien, not, or Chinese generally, because Mandarin is now part of the influence of English, that they are now, like they started to use the ba particle and some other things from Mandarin. So they sell what one? The one here is a nominalizer. So the meaning of this is, what do they sell? And the answer is clothes lot. But since, as Nala mentioned, for the last 5 years or so, since Li Guanyu died, things have loosened up a little bit in terms of allowing some Hokkien and possibly other things will come out now even more. Initially, they were very instrumental in terms of like the things Nala mentioned. Turning to Hong Kong, in Hong Kong, there's been anti-Cantonese ideology for a long time, a very, very strong anti-Cantonese ideology. The ideology is that Cantonese is a useless language, as there are only 69 million speakers. So you can't talk to anyone. This is what they actually used to say. I lived in Hong Kong for 8 years, and they would constantly be banging on about how useless Cantonese is. They would also say that reading or speaking Cantonese is said to negatively influence the acquisition of Mandarin, which is understood as the ultimate goal and so should be discouraged. And this is something that's really deeply ingrained in a lot of the people there. I even had, when I taught there at City U, I had an MA student who did a sociolinguistic type study where she looked at how many pages out of the most popular magazines in Hong Kong, how many pages were written in Cantonese and how many pages were written in Mandarin. And also she interviewed students, young people who read these magazines and asked them why. And so what she found was that 44 out of 46 average pages of these magazines was written in Cantonese. And the reason why the young people liked these is because they were written in Cantonese, and they felt it more comfortable to read in their own language. But this student had this ideology so ingrained in her that her final conclusion was that this is really bad for these students to be reading these magazines in Cantonese because it's going to mess up their Mandarin learning. And that was very disappointing to me, that even after she had done this investigation, she still held on to that ideology. And the government actually had come up with a standardized set of characters, because initially, when you picked up different newspapers or magazines, they used different characters for representing Cantonese, and that made it a bit difficult. But the government came up with a standardized set of characters for writing Cantonese. And Cantonese was used to teach the so-called Zhongman, the Chinese course in the universities, which is Mandarin grammar and lexicon pronounced in Cantonese. It's considered High Cantonese, but it's actually Mandarin lexicon and grammar, just pronounced in Cantonese. In 1997, after the handover, separate classes for teaching how to pronounce Putonghua were introduced as if it were a separate system from what was being taught in the Chinese class. So they would have Chinese class, which was Mandarin grammar and lexicon, but pronounced in Cantonese. And then they would have a separate class for Putonghua pronunciation of just conversation kind of things, and seen as totally separate. But there was eventually supposed to be a switch in the Chinese class to Mandarin, but I don't know how much that's happened yet. But that was official policy as far back as 1997. But now in Hong Kong, efforts to maintain or develop Cantonese are met with resistance from the government. The government sees the defense of Cantonese or the promotion of Cantonese as a kind of dissent and a kind of separatist activity, because it was a big part of the demonstrations in 2019. And so, for example, the Hong Kong Language Learning Association in August 2023 was harassed by the government under the auspices of the new security laws and led to its dissolution. Across the border in Guangdong, this process is greatly advanced. Academics who speak Cantonese never use it in the universities, even among themselves. When I worked there in Zhuhai, just across the border from Hong Kong, I thought I'd be able to use Cantonese all the time, but I was never able to use them on campus. Even if I tried to speak to somebody who I knew was a Cantonese native, they would never respond, almost never respond in Cantonese. Okay, turning to the Philippines. In the Philippines, due to being a former US colony, until the 1987 Philippinization Constitution, English was the main language of education and media, although there were attempts at engineering a national language. After the 1987 Constitution, there was an attempt to move education and the media to using Philippine languages. And it certainly was successful, as for example, TV and education are now almost all in Tagalog, at least in Manila, and probably even more so in the South. It worked almost too well in some people's view, as English proficiency has declined. And this was seen as a threat to the economy because the Philippines has a lot of this call center business. And so there was a government effort to shift back to supporting English education, at least under Arroyo. She shifted a lot of the money that was supposed to go to developing Philippine languages to developing English. In the 2010s, there was an attempt to implement mother tongue-based multilingual education. But rather than treating the mother tongue as the medium of education, they made it a class, as in Singapore, where so-called mother tongues are a class. But given the lack of materials for teaching the local languages and making it a class like that, it was not seen as successful, and so teaching it as a subject has been pretty much abandoned. Now, this is an interesting question that we should be talking about. It seems, from my experience in these different countries, that when you make it a subject, you kill it. The students don't learn it. If you have it as the medium of instruction, the students, then their native language is reinforced and it works with them. And I'll give you an example from the Philippines. So just now I was talking about public education in the Philippines. There's also a parallel education system for ethnic Chinese students, because before 1976, ethnic Chinese people could not become Philippine citizens, and that meant their children could not go to Philippine schools. So they created Chinese-run schools of all types, and they're all fully accredited and whatnot, and they still exist because they're better schools than the public schools. In that system, there was a major shift to Philippinize those schools. In the past, before 1970s, they were half English, half Chinese. And the Chinese was the same curriculum as in Taiwan, because they were all considered Taiwan citizens. This unintentionally led, but the shift to Philippinize, where they reduced the Chinese teaching to only 2 hours a day, and unintentionally led to a loss of language ability on the part of the students from 4 languages, because initially the students would all learn Hokkien, which was the initial language of instruction, Tagalog, Mandarin, and English. And that was reduced to 2, just Tagalog and English, because even with 10 years of Mandarin classes, 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, the students, like all my nieces and nephews, they went through this 10 years of 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, cannot put together a sentence of Mandarin. And the reason for this is that there's no Mandarin environment in the Philippines. To learn a language is a habit. you have to acquire the habit of physically using it, but also thinking in that language. And in the Philippines, there's no Mandarin environment. There's only Hokkien environment because the language of the community, the Chinese community, is still Hokkien. And there's also the four languages had great economic advantages. So my wife was actually president of one of these schools, actually the biggest of the schools, and she reintroduced Hokkien as the medium of instruction at the earliest levels, and found that very quickly the students were again being able to master all four languages because Hokkien is a good bridge to Mandarin. But when they were teaching Mandarin without the Hokkien, when they would just do kind of cold immersion in Mandarin, it just didn't work. It didn't stick at all, and there was no environment to use Mandarin. So that, it makes you think about how to introduce the languages if you want to revive or maintain the languages, not make it a class, but make it the medium of instruction. When Taiwan was part of Japan, the Japanese was the language of instruction, though the local languages were not suppressed. After the ROC army retreated to Taiwan, they outlawed the use of Japanese, Taiwanese Southern Min, and other languages in the media, and more generally enforcing a Mandarin-only policy. This led to many young people losing the ability to use their heritage languages. After the end of martial law, there was a kind of explosion in these languages. They made something and made quite a rebound, actually. I was quite surprised how quickly the languages rebound. For example, on TV, originally you would watch TV and there would be all Mandarin shows except for half an hour of Hokkien news. Now, in many of the channels, you would have all Hokkien and only half an hour of Mandarin news. So it's totally flipped. The government also, at that time, developed materials to teach the languages. Even in the early grades, they developed very nice textbooks for primary school. And online materials such as a very useful dictionary and online teaching program called Guamae, which is I also can. In other words, I can also learn the language. There are also TV channels for different languages, not only for Hokkien, but for Hakka and for minority languages. Mandarin is still the dominant official language, but the people are now free to use their heritage languages as well. Okay, so that was the question of picking whether to try to make one language exclusive or to allow for some diversity. But even if you allow for some diversity, some languages will suffer. Now we turn to the question of language versus dialect, which came up. While we can determine linguistic definitions or criteria for distinguishing language and dialect, the societal view is again an ideological or political one. For example, Norwegian and Danish are almost 100% mutually intelligible, but are considered different languages, while in China, the major branches of phonetic are not mutually intelligible, but are considered dialects rather than languages. And certain varieties of Australian English and certain varieties of American English differ quite a bit, but are considered the same language. Just a side note, I went to see the movie, an Australian movie, Crocodile Dundee, with my brother and my father, and I had to translate the entire movie for them, but they could not understand anything he said. So even though we're speaking the same language, they just couldn't understand it. In China, the makeup of the recognized ethnic groups was decided in the late 1950s they did this big survey of all the people in the country to see what ethnic groups there were, because they had this new concept of Minzu, and so they wanted to see what Minzu they were and determine who was what Minzu, what ethnic group. And they used Stalinist criteria, that great linguist Stalin, and it was often quite arbitrary. and in many cases, speakers of different mutually unintelligible languages were lumped together into newly created ethnic groups. But as there is also an ideology that each ethnic group can only have one language, and all other varieties spoken by that group are considered dialects. So when mother tongue education was briefly rolled out for some ethnic groups, very often the mother tongue they were taught was not a language they were at all familiar with, never mind it being their mother tongue. In some cases, the opposite was done. Speakers of the same language were split into two ethnic groups based only on being in different provinces or even just different counties. The way these ethnic groups were formed and what languages were selected as their official language influenced the vitality and maintenance of the languages, because as Gerald Roche has talked about quite a bit, once you select one standard, then all of the others that aren't selected are subject to erasure and suppression. He has talked mainly about the Tibetan area, but it's a general principle. And this brings up the question of what variety we take as representative of a language. We now have ISO codes, but I think these are problematic because language is human behavior. It's not a thing. It's not amenable to standardization unless you have a committee doing the standardization. It is like if we gave ISO codes for distinguishing styles of dress, one for Gothic, one for grunge, or for styles of cooking or style of eating. Even when a standard variety is established by a committee, different varieties still develop in each area as non-native speakers acquiring the standard variety adapted to their own habits. So we now have many varieties of Mandarin popping up all over the place. And there is a linguist from Singapore, Zhou Qinghai, who has been collecting data from all of these new Mandarin varieties that are different from each other because they're all adaptations to individual places. And they can become mutually unintelligible, as in the case of one video posted on Victor Mayer's language log, where it's Mandarin, but spoken in a place where the Mandarin has already kind of morphed into something that say northern speakers of Mandarin don't understand. They didn't even realize it was Mandarin. There's also a problem with what the concept of mother tongue. In Chinese, Muyu, or so-called mother language, is often equated with native language or mother tongue in English. But the concept is very different, as it refers to the emblematic language of the ethnic group rather than the first language one acquires, regardless of what that language is. This allows the governments in Singapore and China to have so-called mother tongue education based entirely on ethnic background rather than the appropriate language for the student. And this is kind of what Nala was talking about, that they were forced to take mother tongue classes, but wasn't necessarily, what they were taught was not necessarily their mother tongue. So if you were Chinese, you had to study Mandarin, even if you've never heard Mandarin before. In Hong Kong, there has been a policy of mother tongue education, but as far back as '97, the plan was to redesignate Putonghua as the mother tongue of the people of Hong Kong, and so change the teaching medium. Okay, the last thing is talk about the nature of language. Communication is situated action or behavior. I mentioned Grice here, but this actually goes all the way back to Wilhelm von Humboldt in the 19th century. Language is habitual behavior which emerges out of communicative interaction, not a thing. And it reflects, as will all cultural behavior, a way of understanding and dealing with the world, which is also a form of habit. The goal of anthropological linguistics, going back to von Humboldt, Boas, Sapir, Whorf, and on up to present cognitive linguistics, has been to document the different worldviews of the people speaking different languages. The cognitive categories manifested in the use of each language, the meaning is in the use, by the way, not in the forms, reflect the worldview of the speakers and are unique to those speakers, except in language context situations with high levels of multilingualism, where there may be convergence of worldview, which can also lead to convergence of language use. So here's an example from Singapore. where I haven't glossed the Chinese because I don't need to, because the Singlish is word for word what the Chinese is. So it's really just a relexification of the Chinese. And the Malay has changed because of the bilingualism of Malay speakers in Singapore in Singlish. So their Malay has also changed to be word for word the same in this sentence. This is very similar to Gumpert's Skupar study in India, where you had Marathi, Kannada, and Urdu being spoken basically word for word the same with different forms. And we saw Elizabeth's example of Kahavu and standard Taiwan Min in her example 20. Oops. This happens to some extent in all languages. As Salikoko Mufwene has argued, there is really no difference between Creole and non-Creole languages, as all have been deeply influenced by language contact and convergence. Peter Ladefoged, when he was doing his survey of the phonetics of the world languages back in the 1980s, told me he did not work on languages with less than 100,000 speakers, as he felt they would have been already so influenced by more dominant languages, they would no longer have anything interesting left to study. So there's then, if we can then take the forms of the language as definitional about the language, as in a debate I had with Salikoko Mufwene about Singlish. Do we see Singlish as a Sinitic variety because the worldview it's expressing is a Sinitic worldview, or do we call it an English variety because it has English forms? He took the latter view, I took the former view, because for me it's the worldview that's more important than the particular words you use to express it. As I mentioned, Singlish seems to be a simple relexification of Hokkien with English words, using English words to express Hokkien cognitive categories. And this sort of replacement has been going on also because the Malay words are being replaced as well now with English words, but the concepts are often still the same. This is actually how most people learn a second language, at least initially. In other words, they don't change their way of thinking, they just use new words to represent the existing categories they have. So adstratum, substratum, and superstratum influence all involve carrying the habits of use of one language over to another, including the cognitive habits. In China, there has been massive migrations throughout its history. In fact, the whole history is one of migration. And these migrations have been the thing that have led to the development of the different varieties of Sinitic. So a new way now of doing Chinese historical linguistics, not depending on rhyme books and things like that, using natural attested data and the traditional comparative method, and also bringing in the migration history, was developed by Jerry Norman and more recently further developed by South Coblin, Shen Ruiqing, Zhuang Tusheng, and Guo Bijie, Akitani Hiroyuki. They link the different strata of phenomena in the language to the major migration events. And this leads us to very different insights about the varieties. So he had made major advances in the understanding of the history of the varieties. For example, rather than assuming the Min varieties are the oldest of the Sinitic varieties, as Bernard Colgren had done, once we take the migration history into account, we find Min to be one of the latest varieties to form, as late as 300 AD. Why it is important to understand the worldview of the speakers. Just to tell a quick story about the situation in Alor, a former colleague of mine named František Katokvil, who did his PhD with Margaret Flory about 15 years ago, had been working with the Abui language in Alor for all this time. And Alor is a malaria hotspot, and a lot of young children die from malaria every year. And so they sent in medical teams, Indonesian medical teams, to teach the people about malaria and give them um, mosquito nets, and they built hospitals and tried to get people to go to hospitals when they had fever. But they were not successful at all. And so the medical team brought in anthropologists, but the anthropologists didn't speak Abui, and so couldn't figure out what was going on. So then they brought in Frandishek, and Frandishek was able to show why the efforts to reduce malaria in Allah were not being successful, because he talked to the people in their own language and learned to understand their way of construing the world. And in their way of construing the world, they didn't have a concept of malaria. What they had was 5 different fevers that we would all say are malaria, but they saw them as different types of fevers, and 3 of them were caused by not by mosquitoes. None of them were caused by mosquitoes, but to them, 3 of them were caused by curses put on by shaman. And so, of course, you don't go to a hospital when you get one of those fevers. You go to a shaman who then can try to remove the curse from you. And so once they understood how different, so actually the Abui people thought that these Indonesians had brought in malaria, and it had come in with the mosquito nets. So that's why they didn't use the mosquito nets. They thought the mosquito nets were causing malaria, because this was a totally new illness for them, this malaria, because it was an Indonesian concept, not an Abui concept. So it's really important to get to the cognitive categories of the speakers if you want to be able to understand why they do what they do. And this is why in recreating or reviving languages that are no longer used, the result is quite different from the original. For example, Israeli and ancient Hebrew. If you talk to people in Israel, the average people, they think they're speaking ancient Hebrew. But the words are from Hebrew, but the way that they are used and the cognitive categories they represent are based on the linguistic and cognitive habits manifested in the European languages, like Yiddish, that the early Israeli settlers spoke. This is quite controversial in Israel, but it is the case. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that, and I'll make if anybody wants any of the references, I'll make the slides available. I already sent it to Jenny. So now let's open it up to the open discussion. We can really talk about any of these. If you want to talk about these issues, that's okay. If you want to talk about any other issues that came up, that's okay. Add things from your papers or bring up new things that you didn't have time to cover. All of these are possible. So there's one question in here. Yeah, so the question is, thank you so much for the presentation. Could you share your thoughts on the necessity and the role that human beings play in preserving languages in the future? Languages are not the only thing we lose from the globalization process, and together with the loss of many languages and cultures, people also embrace new creations of languages, new Mandarin variation that you mentioned, and cultures. Also, as AI develops, if one day linguists can simply enter some data into the model and the AI can generate conversations of extinct dialects, could that be considered successfully preserving an endangered language? Okay, to answer that one first, language is always changing. We can't hold on to it. This is why I think ISO codes are also not really sensible, because language is constantly changing. It's behavior, and just like our other behavior, every time we engage in it, we change it a bit. So it's it's not something that we can pin down. It's like trying to nail mercury to a table. It moves all the time, so you can't really nail it down. We can take snapshots of languages. We can do a documentation, and I do documentation because I've written grammars and collected texts and things. And we do that as a snapshot of the way people are behaving at a particular time, and also it represents a way of thinking. But we can't stop it from changing. And, as I mentioned, language contact is a big factor in that change all the time. So we're always learning from other, or taking things from other languages, especially something like English. I mean, there's an old saying that about English, just almost like a gangster, just rifling the pockets of anybody that comes by and to steal things. So it's not that we can freeze these things. I mean, we can freeze them and put them in archives and whatnot, and so that at a certain time, this is the way this person spoke. And there's also so much variety because each person's understanding of the language or learning of the language is subjective. We don't learn the same language. We each learn based on our own individual experiences. So everyone's language is different. And so you can say, okay, I have recorded this person or even these 10 people, but that doesn't necessarily represent the entire language. And so everything we do is really just what we can do, because language is changing. It's also variable between speakers. It's variable between times. So we can record as much as we can. And we can also appreciate when new varieties develop. With AI, I've given a lot of talks about the dangers of AI. AI so far, the large language models, is really just statistical probability. It's not thinking. It's not really doing things that anything like human communication. It's really just copying the human communication that was trained on identifying patterns based on statistical probability, and then copying them and producing something that looks like normal language, but it's a lot of nonsense often. And so you cannot depend on AI, the current models of AI, the large language models, for any kind of analysis or any kind of factual information. It will make up stuff all the time because it doesn't know truth from false. If they develop artificial general intelligence, then it will be very different, but we will all be killed probably by that, so it won't make a difference. I'm not joking either. Another question: it seems that people rarely talk about language proficiency in preserving endangered languages as they do in second language acquisition. I'm just wondering what it means to preserve a language. If a child can only use an endangered language in limited settings, but not to chat about abstract concepts coherently, would that be considered acquired and endangered language? This is a good question because I had a student back in 2006 who wrote a dissertation on the commercialization and museumification of Ainu. She had worked with the last living speaker of Ainu, and but there was this whole industry that had developed around Ainu to teach people Ainu for the purpose of commercial tourism and also for use in museums. So these people were not really learning to be able to converse in the language that well, but they were just very specialized purposes. Now this was still seen as revitalization to some extent, but very limited. And I don't know if you would want to say that they acquired an endangered language or they acquired language at all, but it was useful for what they wanted it to do. And then of course everything that we do, as long as it's useful for what we want to to use it for, then that's fine. We don't necessarily need to carry it farther than that. And as I mentioned, if you try to recreate a language, you're going to create something different from what was there originally anyway. So I don't know what you get from that, unless it serves some purpose, like with the Ainu commercialization, museumification. Does that answer the questions?
Any other questions, comments? Okay. Professor LaPolla?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's
Yeah, I
not
have
so
a question
loud, but
about you.
Go ahead.
So,
Yeah. Oh, Georgia. Oh, yeah.
Hello?
Hello, Professor
Hello.
LaPolla?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm Rao Xingham from the National Taiwan Normal University. Yeah, you mentioned about English, and yeah, probably this is not the main point, but you mentioned that you wonder whether Singlish is a synthetic variety of an English variety.
Right.
Yeah, and you probably will inform one. Yeah, I know you also did a lot of great works on typology. So it's the question led me to think about the status of Southern Ming. Yeah, because now most of the typologists will categorize Southern Ming as a Sinitic language under the Sino-Tibetan family. But according to what we know in the history, the so-called ancestor of Southern Ming, the Old Ming, was originated in somewhere out of the very ancient Chinese empire. So it is possible that Southern Ming has its origin in the other language groups, for example, like Kra-Dai languages. And after the place, the region was conquered by the Chinese empire, and due to the language contact, straightened and finalized. Because we know that, for example, like scholar like Hashimoto Mantaro, he mentioned that language contact is such an important factor in East Asia that all the similarities we observe among the languages spoken in East Asia probably is not something descended from a common ancestor, but the result of heavy language contact. So I wonder, do we have that kind of critical evidence we found among Indo-European languages that all these so-called Sinitic languages are descendants of a common origin? Whether we have the same critical evidence that we found among the Indo-European languages? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yes, we do. We have quite a lot of evidence that the Sinitic languages began in the middle reaches of the Huanghe River, the Yellow River, and migrated. This is Sino-Tibetan generally started there, and then you had migrations to the west and southwest, which became the Tibeto-Burman speakers, and then we have towards the south and southeast, which became what we think of now as the Sinitic speakers. And there's quite a lot of things. I've written myself quite a few papers on the migrations and on the influence of these migrations in forming the Sinitic languages as they are now. So you had not just a few migrations, but we had massive constant migrations going on as I mentioned, it's really the history of China is one of migrations where there were government-sponsored migrations, there was migrations due to wars, due to famine, due to other natural disasters, due to change of dynasty. and you had tens of millions of people moving within a short time from one area to another. And so there was contact, and usually when I've written quite a lot about this stuff. So if you look in the references of my handout, you can download them. I've even given links so you can download the papers. Most of the time when they moved into it, because when the Chinese, the Sinitic or the Sino-Tibetan, I should say, started in the Yellow River, they were not alone in the area we think of as China. There were other civilizations south and east and west of where they were. And so when they moved into areas where there were other people. And so there was mixing with other people. And we certainly know that there were not only mixing with Miao Yao and Zhuangdong, but others that possibly like Nanyang, the Austroasiatic and whatnot, is one theory, particularly for Min, because you have words in Min that are not Chinese at all, like bak for meat, and but the current view on Min, I also have a paper on this. The current view on Min is that it was formed by 3 migrations into the Fujian area, one from kind of southwest Zhejiang around the 2nd century AD. Another one was from the west, from Jiangxi, the southern part of Jiangxi, eastern into the western part of Fujian. And these 2 migrations formed what we think of now as the inland Min, because the Min doesn't form a single variety. Actually, if you try to reconstruct a single proto-Min, you can't. There are a lot of words that you have to reconstruct to different forms, and there are a lot of features. Like the features you mentioned, the supposedly old features of Min, actually are only found in the coastal varieties of Min. And those were due to a different migration, which was down along the sea coast from the Wenzhou area. And so we're pretty clear now about the development of a number of these varieties. And South Coblen's work, which I also give a lot of citations for, these are also easily available either from the Academia Sinica or from Academia EDU, which lay out, because he did a very careful job of separating out the different historical strata in the different varieties and showing their relationship to the different migration events that happened over the history. And then it gives us a timeline, a very good timeline of when things happen. So Karlgren, the reason why Karlgren thought that Min was very old is 2 things. One, there are some elements that were part of the early migration from Zhejiang that retained, because one of the migrations into Zhejiang was at a very early time, about 2,500 years ago. And so some of those features were part of the migration from Zhejiang into the Min area. But the other thing is because the Min area was not part of the Chinese cultural sphere at the time that the Jie Yun was written. So Karlgren thought that Min was old because it was not reflected in the Jie Yun. But the reason why it wasn't reflected in the Jie Yun is because the Min area did not have a reading tradition, because what the Jie Yun is a collection of reading traditions from different places and different times, different rhyme books. So it didn't include anything from the Min area because the Min area was not really part of the cultural area, the Chinese cultural area at the time, and so they didn't have a reading thing. They were still a kind of outpost at that time. So that's why in Hokkien you say "cu" for house. That actually goes back to Mandarin pronounced "shu," which means like a garrison. And then you also Min people when they refer to themselves, they don't say they're Hanren, they say they're Deng Lang. They're Tang people, and also Deng Suan is their name for China, which means the Tang Mountain. So this is more evidence that they really joined the Chinese kind of cultural sphere at a later time than the other one. So we put the formation of Min around 300 AD, 4th century, beginning of 4th century.
Thank you. And also a very short comment. I won't call the Taiwanese Southern Ming or simply Taiwanese as a minority language, because it was the lingua franca before the KMT came to Taiwan after World War II. So yeah, it's a marginalized lingua franca in Taiwan. I mean the Taiwanese. Yeah, that's
right. It's like what
happened
in Singapore. It's the same thing as in Singapore, where Hokkien was the major lingua franca, but the government decided that it wasn't. They didn't want to maintain that. They wanted to switch to Mandarin and English. The same thing when the KMT took over. They wanted to suppress that and make Mandarin, even though the interesting thing is the KMT was mostly people from the Jiangzhou area, so they didn't speak Mandarin. And so the Mandarin in Taiwan is quite different from the Mandarin in the mainland. And also because there are so few native speakers of Mandarin. There were some Shandong people, but they were mostly Bubing. So they foot soldiers, so they didn't really have much political influence. But the ones who had political influence were Wu speakers, not Mandarin speakers. And so there was very little in the way of people to be role models for Mandarin. So what happened is you have the Min speakers speaking to each other in Taiwan, and so they just followed their own habits. And so the Taiwanese Mandarin reflects very strongly the Taiwanese Min way of thinking and speaking.
Any other questions, comment?
Randy, Nala here. Nice to
Yeah.
see you, even though we're
I think you should.
Okay. You hear me, Randy?
Hi, Nala.
Oh.
Yeah, I
Hi.
can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay. Anyway, I'm walking to the mic. I hope you don't mind if I comment on the couple of questions that were asked earlier as well, because but of course feel free to provide your perspective. So someone asked earlier, so what does it matter because new languages or new varieties of languages are created? I just don't think they're created at the same rate that languages are lost, and that's an important consideration as well. And each language is unique and all that. Then the other question was on whether or not it matters because you can feed it all into a large language model and it can create something like ChatGPT for you in that whatever language it is. But the truth is, a lot of languages that we're considering are under-resourced. You wouldn't be able to build an LLM of the kinds of languages that we're considering at all. So without the kind of work that people are doing here on the language that we're working on, it would never be possible to get to that point. So those, of course, it would be nice to think about it that way. That maybe it doesn't matter if it's because we still be able to preserve the language in that form. The truth is that we won't get there for a lot of languages that we're considering here. So just two very short comments on the questions that you answered earlier. But feel free to provide your perspective as well. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I didn't mean to say that we shouldn't pay attention to languages. Of course, a language that has been in use for a long time, even though, as I said, it does change constantly, will manifest a particular worldview, and that's just what makes the languages interesting and worth recording. A newly created language is going to basically just reflect whatever I wasn't talking about newly created languages at all, but all I was saying was that languages are changing all the time. And so once you create a language, though, this is what happened with Esperanto and all these other international languages, that they didn't stand still. That as soon as you create a language, it starts changing. And so even though Esperanto was started as a so-called universal language, it couldn't really work that way, because once people start using it as a native language, it changes, and so then it's no longer a universal language, because it's the language of a particular set of speakers. So these things will happen. We will have changes coming again, partly sometimes because of language context, sometimes for technological reasons, sometimes for other things. And in terms of the large language models, I had this problem recently that Chang speakers, I documented the Chang language many years ago, and some Chang speakers came to me and wanted me to help them create a large language model, AI type Chang, an AI type algorithm that could deal with Chang. And so I said to them, the first thing is you need a large database of data to train the system. We can do it. It's not a problem to do it. The machine can learn it on its own. It did Persian. Even ChatGPT learned Persian on its own. The problem is getting some data, and it doesn't have to be the 100 billion word data that English was trained on. It can be much smaller. I've seen work done on much smaller amounts of data where you can still train up the algorithm pretty well. So, but exactly how much is enough is not clear yet. But it doesn't have to be quite so big. And in fact, some people argue that smaller training data actually will make better chat boxes, rather than being so all over the place, like ChatGPT 3.5 was all over the place with all of this wiki data and things like that. So it came up with a lot of nonsense and biases and whatever. So it's not impossible, but it would be something useful for translation, and translation in particular could be a much smaller thing, much smaller set of data that you could use. And that would be a first step. There's certainly a lot of apps now. It's very easy to make apps for your phone. And this is one of the things we do in language documentation is we get native speakers, we give them this app for their phones that they can use the language more easily, like input systems and dictionaries and things you can put on a phone so they can maintain their languages more easily. So there is things that technology can do, and it's just as the technology develops, there will be more things we can do, but it may take some time, that's all.
Thank you, Randy.
No problem. Your talk was great, by the way.
Thanks. Professor LaPolla, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I have a more general question, which is like inspired by your previous slides and so or you can say assimilation of many of these languages, they happen almost simultaneously with the formation of nation states. So it's like and also the very concept of like one nation, one language. So it's like simultaneously reducing the linguistic diversities dramatically. So like my question is, do you think it's like inherently conflicted between the linguistic diversity and nation state, this ideology concept? Or I can like ask another way, is there any positive examples where any nation states can keep their linguistic diversities and where multiple languages can coexist like peacefully and happily without being endangered? Or do we have to like abandon the very concept of nationalism ideology or like nation state concept in order to keep linguistic diversity?
Right. So
that's my question. Thanks.
Jeffrey Benjamin's article about the nation state, and he was arguing that there are certain things that the nation state is a very recent concept, by the way. It's not an old concept. This is a modern thing, nation state. In the past, people had diversity of languages. Even in China, there was no, I mean, there was what they called the Guanhua, which was changed at different times, but it was the language that the officials would talk to each other. But the average people all spoke different languages, and they would often be multilingual. And if you go to the minority areas of China, there were also many languages spoken, and people just speaking 4, 5, 6 languages, no big deal. And so this was more like what the past was before the nation state. It's only with the modern nation state that they came up with this idea that one nation needs to have one language and possibly suppress the other languages, or at least subjugate them in some way, or just ignore them. But in the US, actually, we don't have a national language, although some people have argued we should, but there are some people who don't like the fact that we have all these other languages that are given status in America. So it's kind of shifting now because of these idiot Republicans. But in the past, any language that whatnot. And so if you were going to vote, you could get voting information in Spanish or in Chinese or in whatever language you spoke. But now a lot of states have cut back on that because a lot of these right-wingers think that that's pandering to immigrants, and they don't like immigrants in the first place. So there's all this anti-immigrant stuff. But in the past, it worked really well in the U.S. that I grew up in New York, and there are 800 languages spoken in New York. So it's not really a problem. We see that as a richness. And so my family spoke Italian. We learned foreign languages in primary school. And so now there is quite a movement to study urban languages in the U.S. Aside from New York, Houston, a linguist I know has been documenting the 600 or so languages in Houston. So it's possible that this diversity can be appreciated and even nurtured, but it takes a certain tolerance. Unfortunately, in the US now, there are a lot of people who are quite intolerant of immigrants. And that's a really sad thing, because it wasn't like that so much in the past. Because all of us are immigrants. Some more recent, my family more recent than others, but everybody's an immigrant except for even the Indians are immigrants, but they were 20,000 years ago. That's a long time ago. So but the rest of us were here in the last few hundred years. Not here, I mean, in the US, the last few hundred years. So it's kind of, unreasonable to say, oh, it's okay I came, but it's not okay if other people came. That's not justifiable.
Any other questions or comments?
Answer your question.
Yeah, I think that are you implying they are indeed inherently conflicted? Oh, sorry, I should come to it.
Then yes. So as I mentioned,
they are inherently conflicted.
Yeah. If you pick one language for special treatment, then yes, then you're not giving special treatment to other languages. And so if that's the case, then yeah, there's a conflict between trying to maintain diversity and also picking a single language. Now, of course, as I mentioned, it's this thing about the modern nation state. It's not absolutely necessary for a nation state to pick one language and suppress the others, but it is very frequent to happen. So like I mentioned, in the US, it didn't happen until recently. Some people, this English only, they have this so-called English only movement where they want to wipe out all the other languages and just have everybody forced to use English, at least in terms of the government support. So taking away the government support for all the other languages. But in many countries, like in China and whatnot, they did assume that you had to have only one language and all the others need to be suppressed. So then there is certainly a conflict between trying to unify a nation state and having diversity within that nation state.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, answer my question.
Any other
Okay,
questions?
good, thanks.
No, I have actually one question. My question is related to the previous question. And you mentioned that language is fluid, and everybody knows that. I think everybody can accept that. And the descriptive linguists can do is to sort of describe what the current state of the language. That's all we can do. The language changes naturally. So there's a natural process of language change, but at the same time, as you just mentioned, that this political force which will change the course of the nature of the language. So that's one type of artificial influence by the third party. What I started to understand was that what linguists are doing, people who go into the field and describe and try to revitalize the language, we are actually intervening. We are trying to do perform some artificial effect. So the outcome will be something different, new language, as you said, right? So, so my question is, what is the purpose of revitalization? I know that everybody cares about our languages, small languages, but what is a bigger, picture that we should hold so that we will not go to wrong direction? And what is the benefit for the speakers of the community? That's my question.
Well, it depends. In terms of documentation, I don't get involved in revitalization because as I mentioned, if it's already a dead language, the thing you revitalize is going to be very different from the original. I mean, people can do it for whatever, identity issues or whatever they want to do it for. But what I've done with the languages I've worked on is, if the speakers want to maintain their language, I will help them produce pedagogical materials, dictionary, grammars, even pedagogical grammar, things like that, and also train up native linguists. Every language I work on, I train up a native linguist to PhD, so that a person can continue, even if I no longer work on the language, that person can continue to work on the language. And when you do this, for example, it also depends on the people, what they want. So when I work, Dulong and Rawang are the same language, but spoken on two sides of the China-Burma border, the Myanmar-China border. So the Dulong live on the Chinese side, and they, when I asked them, do they want, a writing system, and do they want, help preserving their language or whatever, they said, no, we're happy to get rid of the language because in their context, they are discriminated against because of speaking with an accent. And then they also feel that, oh, well, we have Chinese, we don't need any other writing system, we don't have to write Dulong. And so they just really didn't want anything like that. So I just did my documentation and really did very little more than that. Whereas on the other side of the border, the Burmese side, it's called Rawang on that side, but it's the same language. They were very interested in having a certain legitimacy for their language because with a lot of minority peoples, they are often told that what they speak is not a real language and this and that. And so what they really wanted was a dictionary, and that was evidence to them that their language was a real language. So I created a dictionary, but actually in the end, the PhD that I trained up from their community, I put his name on it. I put him in charge of it, and in the end, and had him publish it, so that it had even more legitimacy than if I published the dictionary. And more authenticity. And so it was a Rawang Burmese English dictionary, trilingual dictionary. And they were very, very happy with that. And I saw also in India, a former postdoc of mine, Mark Post, he did a very good grammar and on other materials on Galo, a language in India that was not considered one of the scheduled tribe languages. In India, to get certain government benefits, like be able to go to school and use your language in the school, you have to be a scheduled tribe. But once he had produced all of these materials on the language, the people who spoke the language were then able to apply to the government for scheduled tribe status, and they were successful, and so now their language can be taught in school. So this is a major thing that linguists can do in terms of giving status to it. But again, which variety you use, like with the Rawang people, even though I helped them with giving status to this variety, the main dialect that they wanted me to work with, the other dialects are not very happy with that because they think that their dialects, just like in China, before and many other places in India, they used to have riots when they would try to make Hindi the national language, because the other dialects, the other languages would say, wait a minute, why should they be it? Even in the Philippines, there are a lot of people who are not happy with Tagalog being chosen as the base for Filipino, the national language, because there are certain other, Ilocano and other varieties, Cebucano, that are quite large and could have also been chosen. Just like in China, other varieties, Cantonese was seriously considered as the national language of China. But in the end, they went with numbers because the Mandarin speaking area is bigger. So it's a matter of choices that the people, the speakers, have to make. And as a linguist, it's not like in the past where we would just go in there and kind of take the data and then leave and stuff. It's now much more a collaborative effort when we're doing things, and you have to do what they want you to do. And also, you can, of course, try to convince them to do certain things if you think it's good for them. But then again, that's your opinion, and it may not be good for them in their environment. So it's much better to always listen to them and see what they want and help them do what they want. And you can get your data, that's fine. But also be able to help if they want to maintain the language, fine. If they don't want to maintain the language, then there's nothing you can do other than record it for posterity. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, yes, thank you so much. We have time for one more question. Jasmine.
Hi, this is Chapman from Hong Kong. Since you mentioned Cantonese, I think I want to make some short comments. First of all, I understand that like there are cases in which like the political factors affect the use of a language, but it seems that in the case of Cantonese, it's more like it's the self-marginalization that came first, and then people and claim that the use of like regional language will go against the nation state concept, and then promote the nation state like standard language and go against Cantonese. So I like from like at least from Hong Kong, like we can see that it's more like the political suppressions usually comes later if there's any. It's usually the self-marginalization that comes first. Not sure if it matches with your experience or observation or not.
I'm not sure what you're referring to because in the past, there was also another change that happened in Hong Kong, which is when the Brits were still there, people spoke much better English and much more English. And so I actually found it difficult, even though I spoke Cantonese, I found it difficult to get people to speak to me in Cantonese. Even if I spoke to them Cantonese first, they would answer in English, whereas that doesn't happen now. So since the Brits left, there has been a drop in the use of English. And so there's a lot more Cantonese used, and people just talk directly to me in Cantonese all the time now when I go to Hong Kong. So this is something that makes me happy, but it shows that there's been a shift in the language. But I have never seen Cantonese people self-marginalize. What are you referring to when you say they self-marginalize? Other than this what I talked about is this ideology against Cantonese. In terms of specifically in terms of writing, but also even in terms of speaking to some extent. Is that what you're talking about? This ideology that I mentioned about the kind of anti-Cantonese ideology?
In terms of writing, yes, it has always been the case, and I think that there are also always claims that English is used less now and more Cantonese is used. I'd say that's true, and at the same time, the English proficiency of Hong Kong residents actually has gone up a lot. So it's like now 2/3 of the population speaks English, as in like back in 1997, only 1/3. So I guess like it's from my perspective and my observation, it's more like it's not like we hate or we use English less. It's more like we have more chance to use Cantonese now. But back to the self-marginalization thing. It's kind of happening like we decide, like many parents decide not to give birth to children because of fear of whatever political or linguistic issues. And there are also parents who try to make their kids learn English and Taiwan Mandarin.
Taiwan Mandarin?
On top of or instead of Cantonese. Because if a parent hates like his party, then they will want their child to learn the Taiwan version of Mandarin instead of the mainland version of Mandarin. But
that's interesting if they do that.
Of course, it's not widespread, but I've seen lots of Facebook posts. You can easily find like hundreds of them.
Yeah. But the learning of English is something that has been a goal for a long time, even before the handover, because this is one of the reasons why Filipino maids were so popular until they started to organize and fight for better rights. They were the most popular ones because the parents assumed that the kids would learn English from them, even though it was Filipino English. Also with the universities, I taught at City University where it's one of the second-tier universities. And so we didn't get students who actually were very good in English, but we were supposed to be an English medium university. But we generally had to mix languages. The most frequent thing I heard as a teacher was, I don't understand. and so I'd have to repeat it in you know, the content in Cantonese or whatever, slow English. So English has been a goal for a long time, but whether or not they think you have to give up Cantonese in order to learn English, that's another question, because in the past they didn't seem to, at least I have a lot of friends in Hong Kong, and no one has ever talked to me about not teaching their children Cantonese or anything like that, that they would teach them Cantonese and they use Cantonese in the home and in the society. But they would also want to learn these other languages. Mandarin was not on the scene at all when before the handover, but now it's important to learn Mandarin. But if they're learning Taiwan Mandarin, that's quite interesting. That it's a sign of dissent. Kind of interesting that they would do that.
Yeah. And among parents, like there's a trend of sending children to international schools so that they speak more English, and they prefer like using English than using Mandarin. But at the same time, like at the cost of Cantonese. It's like just some recent observations in his like 3 to 5 years.
Okay.
Right. Well, that could happen.
Thank you.
All right.
It's about
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay.
For your...
Randy, don't go yet. Julian is going to close the symposium now, and
And we
then
will have a discussion with
and we want to talk
about
to you.
publication after this stage.